Hi everyone, and welcome to another our SFP at EQ webinar series. Today we are going to feature Dr. Alex Filkov. He's a senior research fellow at the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He holds a PhD in ecology from Tomsk State University in Russia. His early research focused on developing new deterministic and probabilistic models to predict forest, grass, and pit fire hazards. He has changed his research topic lately to focus on the impact of wildfires on structures. He currently serves at multiple committees. Sorry, someone tells me you cannot hear anything. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Julian. All good.
All right.
Anyone from the audience? Can you hear it? Can you hear Julian? Yep. Looks like everything is fine. Just
okay. Yeah, I would ask the person who asked in the chat to check their audio settings. Yeah, sorry for that interruption. Yeah, as I was telling you, Dr. Filkov serves as a co-leader in different committees. Being one of the most important is the Large Outdoor Fires and the Built Environment Working Group for the IFSSS. Well, without no further ado, thank you, Alex, for agreeing to present today. And yeah, with no further ado, I would ask you to share your screen and you can start with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian, for the introduction and yeah, for this opportunity to present for you. Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So yeah, my presentation today will be about wildfires and dynamic fire behaviors. Probably it's not the main focus for you, but because I work mostly in wildfires and wild and urban interface fires, so I'm not really, would say, structural engineer, but I have a bit of experience working on fire performance, fire resistance of materials as well. And during this presentation, I will talk about a little bit about wildfire history in Australia, climate change and its effect on wildfires, and mostly about dynamic fire behaviors. And if you're not familiar with Australia, a bit of context where the most of wildfires or bushfires in Australia, they call it bushfires. So most of forests are located in southwestern part and southeastern part. So Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland. And most destructive and catastrophic fires usually in forested areas. So these areas are, would say, most dangerous in terms of wildfires or bushfires. And if you look back into different significant wildfire events or bushfire events in Australian history, the first one is Port Phillip fire in 1851. You can see this painting showing people escaping from a bushfire. Yeah, a lot of structures were destroyed during this bushfire. Another one is Black Friday fire in 1939, where 71 lives lost and more than 1,000 buildings destroyed. You can see a photograph of this fire. Next one is a fire in Victoria in 1944, 51 people killed and more than 700 buildings destroyed. Another fire is in Hobart in 1967, which is in Tasmania, south of continent. 62 lives lost, more than 1,000 houses destroyed. And this is the 17th largest insurance loss in Australia. More recent ones is Ash Wednesday in 1983. It happened in southeastern Australia, in Victoria and South Australia states. 75 lives lost and more than 1,500 houses destroyed. And this is the 6th largest insurance loss event. Next one is Canberra Fire in 2003, which is the capital of Australia. 4 people killed and more than 500 houses destroyed. And I will talk about this wildfire a bit more in details later, because this one is related to different dynamic fire behaviors. And probably the most catastrophic in terms of life lost is, I would say, famously known Black Saturday fires in 2009, where 168 people lost their lives and more than 2,000 houses destroyed, buildings destroyed. And the recent one is a Black Summer fires in 2019-20 fire season. 33 lives lost and more than 3,000 buildings destroyed. Economy and the impact to the economy is estimated about $50 billion, not US, Australian dollars, sorry. Some estimations show even bigger values because indirect impact is difficult to calculate. House loss over the last 80 years has been dominated by several major events. If you look at this diagram showing number of houses destroyed during the last 80 years, you can see these events. Climate change is making the fire season around the world even worse by extending the number of dry and hot days. A longer fire season is expected to result in more frequent and severe fires. And Australia's bushfire season 2019-20 appears to have supported these conclusions in terms of ecological consequences and impacts to human population. So you can see that the Black Summer fires, the number of houses destroyed significantly higher than in the past events. Wildfire impacts on private property and public lands have increased dramatically during the past few decades. Many of the most destructive fires have occurred in southeastern Australia, California, USA, the Mediterranean region of Europe, southwestern Canada, and Siberian forest of Russia. A number of recent wildfires have impacted communities in locations where historically fires are rare or extraordinary events. The Bureau of wildfires close to the Arctic Circle in Sweden, Norway, Greenland, and Scotland recently, as you can see on this slide. And additionally to the increased number of wildfires or bushfires, we also observe more and more megafires, so-called megafires. For example, the August complex fire in the US, it's the result of 37 smaller fires merged together. And as a result of this fire, one firefighter was killed and 31 buildings or structures destroyed. And Australia is not an exception in this case. During the Black Summer fires, 2 mega blazes were recorded. The Gospers Mountain fire on the left started on 26th of October 2019 and burned approximately 500,000 hectares, becoming one of the biggest forest fires in Australian history. And by 11 January, 3 fires on the border of New South Wales and Victoria on the right, on the slide, merged and created a second mega fire which burned through about 900,000 hectares. Well, wildfires, especially mega fires, create disproportionate risk to environmental or human assets, as they can result in many casualties and loss of property. And in most cases, these consequences are a result of dynamic fire behaviors. They can cause rapid escalation of fire behavior, increasing the danger to ground-based emergency personnel. And even at smaller scales, dynamic fire behaviors can lead to dangerous fire behavior. So this video from our 2018 field experiment in crop fire lines about 200 meters long, and you can observe fire wheels along the fire front, and also strong convection even like small tornadoes at the apex of fire lines. So what are the dynamic fire behaviors or dynamic effects? Dynamic fire behaviors can be described as independently of overall fire behavior, the ability to control such fires and the damage they might deliver. The term dynamic fire behavior therefore refers to physical phenomenon having an unsteady or dynamic nature, rather than a single event combining multiple phenomena to a scale which is uncontrollable or extreme, for instance, extreme fires or mega fires. And to date, there are several recognized dynamic fire behaviors. They are spotting, fire-generated winds, fire wheels, paraconvective events, active and independent crown fires, conflagrations, emergent fires, eruptive fires, and vorticity-driven lateral spread. So this list is not the final list. I believe that with a better detection techniques, we will more dynamic fire behaviors will be discovered. And to understand the importance of dynamic fire behaviors, we initially need to understand how frequently they occur, and then try to gain insight into the conditions under which they occur. Analysis of fires greater than 1,000 hectares showed that more than half of the fires had 2 and more dynamic fire behaviors, as you can see on this graph diagram. Spotting and crown fires were the most frequent dynamic fire behaviors, making up to 50% of all dynamic fire behaviors. Even smaller fires can have multiple dynamic fire behaviors, and dynamic fire behaviors can emerge at any fire scale, and fire area does not limit manifestation of dynamic fire behaviors, as you can see on this slide. A number of fire behaviors for different fire sizes. They can be at small fires and larger fires, and as well their neighbor. Several of dynamic fire behaviors can happen at small fires and large fires as well. So they're not limited to the fire size. And now I'm going to talk about each dynamic fire behavior more in details. And the first one is fire-generated vortices, or FGVs. Fire-generated vortices span many spatial, temporal, and intensity scales. Small FGVs, several meters, are common and transient, tenths of seconds, often presenting as fire wheels along the fire line, whereas larger, long-lived FGVs, hundreds of meters and tens of minutes, are less common but still observed by firefighters. And very good review of FGVs is given in these 2 review papers. If you're interested, have a look. This video on the left shows Chaparral Fire in California 21. It shows generation or creation of fire wheel at the edge of fire front. And lately, this fire wheel converts into vortices, as you can see it here. Another video, this video shows one of our experiments, infrared video. It shows formation of HGV first on the left, and after that formation another one here. It was difficult to observe with naked eye, but infrared can provide us some additional insights. Another type of FGVs is so-called fire-generated tornado vortices. FGTVs are very rare events with winds up to 60 meters per second, large diameters 100 to 1K, and dynamical links to the updrafts in deep paraconvection. So these events, they create locally erratic conditions, and given that they can lift and distribute firebrands, they contribute to fire spotting on a local scale. For example, Canberra bushfires in 2003. Two fires merged together and created 20 km per hour rate of spread and massive spotting. And as a result of this dynamic fire behaviors, a lot of houses were burned very deep in violent urban interface area. This video shows FGTV formed on top of the large area burning. So you can see that convective column is rotating above the fire. So given the range of sizes, of size scales and conditions which FGVs occur, and the potentially short time scales in which they may develop, the prediction is extremely difficult. Laro with colleagues, they conducted analysis of wildfires using radar data and satellite data, and they have identified two distinct FGTVs. The first one, embedded vortices residing within one branch of counter-rotating pair, so inside those two pairs. And the second one is shredding or wake vortices, these ones, which detach from the fire and progress downstream. So during large significant event, these two types of vortices can be generated, and they can create potential hazard to firefighters or even significantly affect on rate of spread. And to date, there is very little information about these events, especially critical conditions of their formation and collapse, how these events scale from low to large and large to low, and also their contribution to fire behavior. Another type of dynamic fire behaviors is vorticity-driven lateral spread, or VLS. It is also known as fire channeling. Is a rapid lateral fire spread across a steep leeward slope in a direction approximately at the right angle to the prevailing wind. So we can see on this diagram wind blowing this way, and fire propagates perpendicular to it. So VLS can lead to rapid, potentially unexpected escalation of a small fire, which in turn can lead to increased danger to firefighters and the community. And we recorded several cases where firefighters will lost their lives because of this phenomenon, yeah, because they didn't expect this. Sharples in their paper suggested that this process is most likely due to the interaction of a bushfire with a lee slope eddy. They found that steep slopes over 25 degrees and topographic aspects with about 30 degrees of the direction the wind is blowing are necessary conditions for the occurrence of the fire channeling phenomenon. This video shows wind tunnel experiment of VLS. So you can see wind blowing towards us, and fire propagates perpendicular relatively quickly. So that shows this effect at smaller scale. This slide shows multispectral line scan imagery of VLS during Canberra Fire 2003. So more bright color shows active combustion burning. So this is an active front, so you can see wind blowing that way, but fire propagates perpendicular to this way. So this is deep flaming, so-called deep flaming, when a lot of large area burning simultaneously at the same time. And at this stage, there is very little information about VLS because it's a relatively rare event, and it's difficult to study, especially at large scale, because in terms of safety and difficulty, it requires complex terrain and relatively large areas. Another type of dynamic fire behaviors is eruptive fires. Eruptive fire behavior has been reviewed by Vegas and Simeoni in 2010, where they define extreme acceleration as fire blow-up characterized by sudden change of spread rate and energy release rate. Fire eruptions are most likely to occur on steep slopes above 25 degrees, and especially in canyons, because topography plays the role of a constant and strong constraint to the fire, which is similar to the role of strong wind with a constant direction. Dolden and Zinoviev conducted small-scale lab experiments in trenches. They found that for slopes 30 and 35 degrees, the airflow becomes attached to the slope, and the fires on these two higher slopes demonstrate eruptive behavior since their size and rate of spread increase continuously. Rodriguez, in the experiments, they found similar critical angles. Instances of eruptive fire behavior pose significant danger and have resulted in multiple fatalities and serious injuries to firefighters, especially in Mediterranean region. And there is very limited knowledge about eruptive fire behaviors, how this fire behavior, what are the conditions at wildfire scale, because almost all of the experiments that were conducted at lab scale or bench scale, and how fuel effects on eruptive fire behavior is not known as well. Another significant type of dynamic fire behaviors is paraconvective events. Paraconvective event is an extreme manifestation of a flammagenetus cloud generated by the heat of wildfire and often rises to the upper troposphere or lower stratosphere. So we can see here two types of paraconvective events. So they remind like a nuclear explosion. And paraconvective events can be separated into two types. The first one is paracumulus clouds. And the heat and moisture from a bushfire causes air to rise rapidly in the smoke plume. As the plume rises to higher elevations, the atmospheric pressure reduces and it cools, causing the plume air to expand and cool even further. If it cools enough, the moisture in the plume air condenses and forms a cumulus cloud, which, because it comes from the fire plume, calls paracumulus. In the right conditions, the paracumulus cloud can accelerate into the low stratosphere before losing buoyancy. And collisions of ice particles in the very cold upper parts of these clouds cause a buildup of electric charge, which released by as lightning. And having produced a thunderstorm, this cloud is then known as pyrocumulonimbus or PyroCB. PyroCB development is usually associated with large, often crown fires, high energy release, high flames, and indicate extreme fire and dynamic fire behaviors. So as you can see, PyroCBs can result in downbursts on downdrafts, lightnings, initiate new spot fires, and these downdrafts can move a fire front very quickly, increasing rate of spread. PyroCB formations have also been responsible for fires leading to major impacts on communities. For example, the Varuna fire in Western Australia burned about 70,000 hectares, destroyed more than 160 homes, and caused 2 fatalities in 2016. As a result of PyroCBs can be downbursts on downdrafts, which are strong winds on or near the ground. And on this video, you can see microburst. That microburst, it's a meteorological effect, but very similar. So you can see the velocities are very, very high, and it has strong impact on the ground when it hits the ground. And these winds can spread the fire in all directions from the downburst location and have been responsible for deaths and of the firefighters in a number of occasions. Regarding Paraconvective events, there is very limited knowledge about it, especially what fire intensities trigger Paracu or PyroCB, what are the conditions of transition Paracu cloud into PyroCB cloud, and almost there is no information about downbursts when they occur and what the conditions during PyroCB. Crown fires. Crown fires occur in vegetation that have multiple strata, transitioning from surface and understory fuels to canopy fuels under certain environmental conditions. And as you can see here on this diagram, for crown fire, to initiate crown fire requires special layer, I would say, so-called fuel ladder, near surface fuel or elevated and also intermediate fuel. So this is kind of transition fuel from when surface fire transit from the ground to the crown. And this is a necessary condition for the crown fires. Von Wagner recognized 3 types of crown fires. They are passive, active, and independent. And active and independent crown fires are dynamic fire behaviors. And although crown fires have been studied for decades, still there is very limited knowledge about them, especially transition thresholds between 3 types of crown fires, transition of surface fires into crown, and also flammability of live vegetation. What are the conditions of their flammability or instability and combustibility? And to understand the flammability of live plants, it is an important thing, and as they are often responsible for the transition of fire from surface to canopy, influencing heavily on fire intensity and rate of spread. And many studies only use individual elements of a plant, usually leaves, and this method does not account for factors such as physical arrangement of leaves in the plants or litter in the fuel beds. Also, simplistic apparatuses have been used to test larger samples in their natural physical arrangement, and studies on timber building materials demonstrated that more sophisticated apparatuses can be used to control the heating regime, ignition method, and ambient conditions. So in our group, we conducted a series of experiments trying to understand flammability of live vegetation and the effect on transition of surface fire to crown fire. In wildfires, vegetation is exposed to variable radiant heat flux as the fire front approaches due to its dynamic nature. And to account for this effect, we build a variable heat flux apparatus. You can see it on the picture, and developed an experimental method to determine the impact of dynamic radiant heat flux on live plant species, so that more realistic measures of flammability of these species can be gathered. And we tested 2 heating regimes, a static heat flux to reflect current methods and a dynamic increasing heat flux to more accurately replicate an approach in fire front. And the experimental time for the static and heat flux was calculated to ensure that samples were exposed to the same total radiant heat exposure as for dynamic regime. Piloted ignition and auto ignition were tested during these experiments. And in our experiment, we tested 2 distinctive fuel types, would say. The first one, live species, and bark. Second one is bark. You can see physical properties here. The first one is very low porosity and low bulk density compared to the bark. On this video, it shows ignition of samples. The top videos, static heat flux, piloted and unpiloted, and bottom one, dynamic heat flux, piloted and unpiloted as well. So you can see the first sample ignited was static piloted, totally consumed. And after that, in terms of time, the second sample ignited under static unpiloted. So this is the same fuel, the same species. After that, ignited piloted dynamic. So we can see pyrolysis and ignition, relative much quicker consumption compared to static ignition, static heating regime, sorry. And the last one, sample under dynamic and piloted ignited. Active pyrolysis and ignition. On this slide, you can see a comparison between these two types of fuel, bark at the top and the same species as before at the bottom. So you can see bark is already burning in the flaming mode, ignited very quickly. This is static heating regime. And at the bottom, it still produce pyrolysis gases and finally ignited and burning. During our experiments, large differences were observed in the results based on both heating regime and ignition type. These results are consistent with past studies conducted on flammability of building materials, and the presence of the pilot igniter greatly increased the likelihood of live sample reaching flaming ignition 2 times and more. Heating regime also affected on consumption time. It was 20% higher in the static heating regime for all species in ignition types except for Cassini and bark in piloted experiments. This can be explained by the different nature of heating regime. For example, for static heating regime, fuel exposed to high level of radiation at the beginning, and because it's live vegetation, it has a lot of moisture in it, it can't combust at the same time. The closest layer of fuel dries out first, ignites and combusts, but the next layer still has a lot of moisture. It takes some time to evaporate that moisture and ignite it, and this process goes step by step until all sample consumed. But for dynamic regime, because it takes much longer to produce the same gradient exposure, it takes longer to preheat fuel, and when fuel reaches critical temperature to ignite, it almost doesn't have any moisture, and once it's ignited, it consumes very quickly. Another dynamic fire behavior is spotting. Spotting is the behavior of a fire producing firebrands or embers that are carried by the wind and which start new fires beyond the zone of direct ignition by the main fire. A firebrand is an object that becomes airborne and has a potential to create a spot fire. And firebrands are created when burning fuels such as bark from shrubs and trees are carried aloft and then transported by the convection column of a fire front and by the wind. So you can see example on this slide of firebrands collected during structural fires and during wildfires. While spotting may occur in relatively small fires, it can be a significant and dangerous contributor to fire propagation in larger fires. The distance up to which spotting can occur depends on the size and shape of firebrand, the type of vegetation, fire size, and weather conditions. And if you look at this diagram, it shows comparison between different firebrands from different sources. So almost all of them from structural fires, except of this one. This is from wildfires. And these two graphs show a distribution of firebrands depending on area and mass for wildfires. So we can see that most of firebrands from wildfires are relatively small and also very light. So most of the firebrands somewhere in this area and very few in this area. But if we are talking about spot fires, so the bigger the firebrand, the more potential it has to ignite spot fire. And spotting consists of three main processes: firebrand generation, how many particles of different mass, size, shape, and material type are produced by fire. Second one, firebrand transport, how far and in what combustion mode, flaming or smoldering or glowing, particles can travel. And this transport can be through two different processes. First one, when firebrands lofted by convective plume and transported further by convective plume. And the second one, when local winds or near ground winds throw firebrands along the ground. And the third process is firebrand deposition or ignition potential. What is the remaining energy temperature of a particle upon landing and its potential to ignite fuel. And if you're talking about spotting, it can be separated into three ranges. The first one is short range spotting up to 500 meters, and medium and long distance spotting, which is about 500 meters. And there were cases when spot fire was recorded 34 kilometers from the main fire front in Australia. So long distance spotting can be very, very long. This video shows short distance spotting. Several firefighters were trapped in a house during Kangaroo Island fire in 2020. And you can see a lot of small firebrands flying around. So this is near ground transport of firebrands. And these firebrands, they create significant danger in terms of they can ignite fuel around structure, or they can accumulate in front of structure or fuel, vegetation, and ignite it. And they danger as well that a lot of houses in Australia were lost because of these firebrands ignited structures after the main fire front passed, and they were glowing or smoldering, and after some time they started fire, and houses were lost. And regarding spotting, the fire community needs to improve the knowledge about each of three processes to better understand the risk of spot fire. Specifically, characterize the number of particles generated during the combustion of vegetation and structures and their physical properties, a quantitative understanding of spotting distance and its dynamics, namely the particle density distribution with distance from the fire front, and also an improved understanding of how firebrands ignite fuels. And we've been working in our group on understanding of these three processes, doing field experiments and also lab experiments. And for example, we collaborating with different organizations in the US, UK, and in Russia as well, trying to improve our knowledge about them. And one of the goals was to use infrared equipment to record generation and transport of firebrands during real fires or prescribed fires, and after that process these videos to get information about size, velocity, and temperature of firebrands. So for this goal, we developed special software which allows process as infrared video. It consists of detector and tracker. Detector detects firebrands on infrared video, and tracker tracks from one frame to another one, so we can calculate velocity of firebrands. And one of the results after one of the experiments using this software, for example, we found that for low intensity prescribed fires, firebrands were detected about 100 meters from the main fire front, and the number significantly increased about 13 meters from the fire front and reached about 200 firebrands per second. And also we found that for short distance spotting, for short distance firebrands, firebrand velocity follows wind speed velocity, which confirms our assumption about local winds or near ground winds, one of the transport mechanism of firebrands. And also processing this video, we could calculate firebrand flux, two-dimensional number of firebrands per square meter, and also three-dimensional number of firebrands per cubic meter. And as you can see, a lot of firebrands are relatively small, and very few big firebrands in the flux. So this software allows us to calculate different characteristics of firebrands and provide better understanding and some background for improvement of fire behavior models. Also, another problem is applicability of lab experiments to extrapolate knowledge to the field scale. And a lot of researchers use reconstructed fuel beds to study flammability or fire propagation in the laboratory. And there is an ongoing discussion how adequately they represent field conditions and how useful they are for field scale fire behavior. We conducted experiments to compare ignitability of surface fuel beds measured in the laboratory and field by quantifying the difference in result between the two approaches. And we measured both the ability of fuel bed to ignite, ignition success, and the ability of fuel bed to propagate, ignition sustained. And we found that laboratory experiments are suitable surrogates for field experiments when considering ignition success. You can see correlation about 0.9. We had only a few successful ignitions in the field, but not in the lab. But if you look at the sustained ignitions, there was much greater discrepancy between the lab and field experiments for the sustained ignitions. So we have some number of successful ignitions in the field, but not in the lab. And we were trying to understand what was the reason of this discrepancy. We tested importance of different variables on ignition success and sustained ignition, and we found that near surface moisture content and near surface cover were most important for explaining this difference. And if you look at the forest structure again, so this is a picture of our field experimental plot. And this is kind of description of different layers of vegetation in the forest. So we can see that in reality, when we study ignition of fuel by firebrands, fuel in the forest, it doesn't contain only liter. So it contains also near surface fuel, elevated fuel, and all of these effects on ignitability and combustibility of fuel. Especially amount of, let's say, dead vegetation in near surface fuel, elevated fuel, and density of it affects significantly on those characteristics. So, and for example, any future field experiments or lab experiments or simulation should be done with caution regarding replicating real-world conditions. Another type of dynamic fire behaviors is emergent fire fronts. The convergence of multiple fire fronts from a single fire, like junction fire fronts or parallel fire fronts, or separate individual fires into larger fires, like fire coalescence, is known as emergent fire fronts. So you can see here, let's say, visualization of those dynamic fire behaviors. Fire coalescence when multiple fires merge together. Junction fires is a V-shaped fire when two lines merge together at angle smaller than 90 degrees, and so-called junction angle. And parallel fire fronts, inward parallel fire fronts. To date, The majority of studies have been in the laboratory, conducting small-scale experiments, and they found that smaller the junction angle, faster the rate of spread. Also, in the laboratory experiments, it was found that the length of junction lines affects on the rate of spread. But at the moment, there is a lack of experimental data to inform model development at larger scales. And therefore, field-scale experiments are required to capture the effect of convection radiation at different stages of the development of emergent fires to improve our understanding of this phenomenon. Another type, not another type, but one of the, let's say, subtypes of emergent fires is conflagrations. A number of them were in the last 10 years in Portugal, Canada, Australia. And here you can see conflagration during Fort McMurray wildfires in 2016, and as well as Black Summer fires in Australia. In bushfire situations, emergent fires sometimes lead to rapid increases in fire intensity and spread rate and even paraconvective events, while at other times could lead to slowing the fire spread due to convective pool effects. This variability in behavior makes the prediction around emergent fire fronts difficult. Potentially erratic behavior and difficulties in suppression allow the fires to burn more intensely over large areas, increasing the likelihood of loss of life, property, and other assets. And as you can see, because it's so large-scale conflagrations, it's difficult to investigate, and only post-fire analysis probably could provide us some information about them. To get insights into emergent fire fronts, we've been conducting field-scale experiments from 2018 using UAVs or drones, with infrared and visual cameras. And to date, we have conducted 5 experimental campaigns in different parts of Victoria and Australia. They include 2 prescribed burns and also 3 harvested crop burns. And during our experiments, we study junction fires during fire front propagation, parallel fire fronts, and also we separate junction fires as forward junction fires and backward junction fires. And another type is fire coalescence, so coalescence or merging of spot fires. And using infrared equipment is very helpful for us because you can see here simultaneous visual infrared, and especially in forested areas due to dense smoke and canopy, it's not possible to detect fire front, but with infrared equipment, it's possible to detect and track fire. This video shows one of our experimental crop experiments. So we try to simulate V-shaped fire and measure rate of spread propagation. So on infrared, you can see this bright color is active combustion zone. This also shows parallel fire front at the top and junction fires with different junction angle, 11 degrees, 41 degrees. As you can see, rate of spread is significantly different between these two junction fires. And during our experiments, we recorded 135 emergent fire fronts. And this slide shows comparison of rate of spread for the data for 3 campaigns. It was observed that propagation of emergent fire fronts was faster compared to other fire fronts, which is consistent with other studies of Vegas. We found that rate of spread of junction fire fronts significantly different and higher than linear fire fronts. So linear fire fronts is regular fire fronts or head fire. And these results are consistent between all our experiments and previous results. Although the average rate of spread of forward junction fires was 3 times that of linear fire fronts, it was significantly higher in many cases. For example, here you can see comparison of forward and backward junction fires with linear fire fronts. And this difference can be up to 18 times. So forward junction fires can be up to 18 times faster than linear fire fronts, and backward junction fires up to 2 times slower. In our analysis, we also separated junction fires based on the junction angle into these 5 groups. And it was observed that the more acute the angle, the higher the rate of spread. As you can see it, this is initial angle, getting smaller and smaller, and the rate of spread is going up. Also, towards the edge of merging, a deceleration of junction fire was observed, but this process was not significant and almost not noticeable. Similar to other studies, we observed that an increase of current junction angle in time for initial angles, for all initial angles except of 60-90. Although the current angle becomes twice as large at the end of merging, the rate of spread didn't change significantly, as you can see from the previous slide. Sorry, one way. This was in contrast to other studies. I'm talking about laboratory experiments. It can be assumed that additional processes are occurring in addition to junction fire configuration. And we found that the value of junction angle increases continuously regardless of the initial configuration of fire lines. And for large initial angles, 60-90 degrees, the current angle decreases during the merging process. And this effect was not observed before. And one possible explanation of this could be due to merging shoulders. We hypothesized that the left and right shoulder of junction fires create complex convective structures and can cause changes in the rate of spread and prevent an increase of an angle between 2 fire lines and fast decrease of rate of spread, respectively. Existing challenges in studying dynamic fire behaviors. Low relative frequency of some dynamic fire behaviors limit knowledge about them. For example, vorticity-driven lateral spread was first described by Sharples in 2012. Also, challenges of identification or limited data and transience of events. Some dynamic fire behaviors occur only at large scales, such as Paracumulus formations and conflagrations, whereas junction fires and fire wheels can manifest at smaller scales and may only occur for seconds or minutes. The same dynamic fire behaviors can manifest at different scales. For example, like spotting can be short or medium or long distance spotting. And interaction of dynamic fire behaviors could have complementary effects on fire behavior. For example, crown fires and Paracumulus formations could facilitate long distance spotting and fire-generated winds and fire wheels. So all of these make the identification of dynamic fire behaviors a very challenging task. And this is it from me. And yeah, thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Alex, for your presentation. Really insightful, covering a lot of topics. I think we are all aware that wildfires are complex phenomena involving a lot of variables and a lot of components for the spread, the behavior, and also for the effects. So yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm waiting in the chat box to see if any of our participants has any question for now. Yeah. In the meantime, I would like to ask you, in your experience when modeling or trying to reconstruct this kind of events, what's the hardest data to source in terms of, I don't know, the environmental variables or the geography of the terrain or the kind of vegetation, what would be the hardest component to source in terms of information?
Yeah, probably the most difficult one is probably to get heat flux. I mean, I'm talking about field experiments, because in lab experiments, everything is under very well control, I would say. But during field experiments, the hardest part is to get information about radiative heat fluxes or total heat fluxes, and especially convection, because as you understand, to get information about 3D vector of wind, you need to have equipment inside the fire, and it's a challenging task. And yeah, we are working on building our own sensor system which can measure 3D wind inside fire, so we can get convective heat flux during fire propagation. So temperatures are easy to get. Let's say environmental parameters like weather, weather stations, so it's not difficult as well. Terrain, digital elevation models, so we have lidars, portable lidars, so now we can obtain a fuel structure with very high precision, so we reconstruct almost every grass or every stem in 3 dimensions for modeling. So probably the hardest part is to get convective radiative heat fluxes from the fire.
All right.
In interaction of fire with atmosphere.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you for your answer. I see one of you the attendees has one question to Alex. Sorry, he says, how do you validate your modeling? Do you have any real bushfire data?
For real bushfire data, we have only rate of spreads, but it's also kind of challenging because for real fires, rate of spread is defined from line scans. So it's airplane with multi-spectral equipment, almost, let's say, like infrared, taking the pictures of fire front every, I would say, depending on the fire, from 1 hour to 12 hours, or 1 day, and so on. So depending how often that plane flies around fire, can be from let's say from 2 to 15 or more line scans with 1 hour temporal resolution, and fire front propagation can be obtained relatively accurately and with good time steps, so for modeling. But usually for large bushfires, fire front propagation information is sparse. And for validation of models, usually we use information from our field experiments, which are not real full scale, but let's call it semi-full scale. It can be hundreds of meters, from tens of meters to hundreds of meters. This is scale which we can relatively well control and get a lot of information. But for real scale, we can have only rate of spread and also some weather parameters, which we can obtain from weather stations. But because weather station is sparse as well, not every weather station has measures all parameters. So it really depends.
All right. Thank you for your answer. And something along the lines of scaling up this behavior. One of our colleagues wonders if, or not if, but how these fire parameters like the ignition time and the flame spread can be extrapolated from the laboratory or bench scale to full scale applications. Yeah,
this is a very good question, because when we started to study emergent fires to junction fires, so we compared them. So we did our field experiments and we compared them with laboratory experiments, and we didn't get comparison. We didn't get agreement. And this shows that scale effect effects on fire propagation, and we can't directly extrapolate results, for example, at least for emergent fires from lab to the field. So that's why we're trying to get kind of better understanding of fire behavior at field scale, doing field experiments, and see how we can use lab experiments as well to get insights into fire behavior. So sometimes it doesn't work. So direct, let's say, transition from small scale to large scale doesn't work. It's not linear.
Yes, it's not an easy process. I think even if in the built environment, we find so many challenges of the different elements. It's even harder in an open fire to environment and with all the interaction with the different atmospheric variables and the terrain and all of the things.
Yeah,
definitely.
especially during large fires, fire becomes so they create their own weather. So they interact with the atmosphere, upper layer of atmosphere, and they behave unpredictably, let's say. So they create their own weather, their own wind, and none of the model can, or at least very few can model with some reasonable accuracy such behavior.
Yeah. Right. Thanks for your question. I think one of our attendees would like to ask you a question. So
I can see, I can see a few questions in the chat.
If they were sent to you directly, yeah, also
okay,
feel free to answer them.
Let me read them first. Okay, hi Alex, this is Anthony from QUT. Brisbane, thanks for your talk. Do you have any temperature heat flux data collected from the bushfire events or modeling that I could get access for research purposes? We have some data from our field experiments. Unfortunately, from real fires, it is not possible to get temperature heat fluxes because firefighters not allowed us to do any measurements or even get closer to the fire because of safety. During prescribed fire experiments where we can participate and use our equipment, we have some data. Yeah, feel free to email me and we can discuss it. Yeah, you can contact Julian or Thomas to ask for my email if you don't have it. What else? Okay, so probably I answered the question, how can fire parameters be extrapolated from laboratory scale to full scale application?
Yes.
No more questions in the chat.
Okay, so one of our attendees would like to ask you a question. So, yeah, there is another in the chat. Yeah, Satarupa. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Hello, Dr. Alex. That was a nice presentation. And yeah, it was actually very enriching for me. I'm a PhD student and I'm also working on fire currently. So I just have a very quick query. Like you mentioned about the fire, wildfire, and also the dynamic fire behaviors. So I was wondering from your experience, like if you have anything to talk about like the communities who are staying in those fire, like in those forests or in the vicinity of those forests. I mean, in case like how they are being affected, or in case their behavior in some sort is catalyzing those fire effects. So I was wondering in case you have to like if you have anything to talk about this from your experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Fortunately, unfortunately, I don't have any experience with evacuation or human behavior. It's not my area of expertise, but just to kind of share information which I have regarding this. It's a bit, yeah, it's a challenging task because decision to stay or defend your structure is a kind of, can cost you life. And recent after 2009 bushfires, government policy is leave early. So before 2009, the policy was you can stand and defend. And because of a lot of life lost during Black Saturday in 2009, our policy changed, and now it is recommended to leave early and you know, to save your life. And what person chooses to do, leave or stay and defend, it's yeah, it really depends on them. And there is a lot of research about behavior and analysis, and yeah, but I can't add more because it's not my area of expertise. Sorry.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, on that question or on that topic, we held a seminar or a webinar last year with Dr. Erika Kulikovsky, one of your colleagues at the University of Melbourne, and I think that's more her field of expertise. So we would invite you to review that webinar, and we can put you in contact as well.
Yeah, Erika from RMIT. Yes.
Sorry for RMIT. Yeah.
And there is another question in the chat.
Yes.
Is smoldering playing a role in ignition after flaming extinction? For example, the static dynamic heating configuration may cause a smoldering ignition before the flaming ignition. Yes, in our lab experiments, we observed smoldering ignition in some cases. Yeah, we observed smoldering ignition first, and after that, flaming ignition. Especially smoldering probably plays important role in fire brands when they accumulate during fire propagation. They can accumulate in some areas, and even after fire front passed, a bit of wind, they can start glowing and reignite fuel. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, to be honest.
Yep. Thank you for your answer on the topic. Yeah, there are different mechanisms as you were mentioning. I would like to ask our attendees if there are any other questions in regards to the presentation. Yeah, it doesn't seem so. Also, Alex, if you would like to mention something on the LOV work group, or
yeah. I would like to say thank you again to the AQ team, especially Julian and Thomas, for inviting me and giving this opportunity to present. And also, I would like to mention about the large outdoor fires and the built environment group, which is part of the IFSS. This group has 3 different subgroups, and I am part of the ignition resistance committee. We're trying to, let's say, collect knowledge about different mechanisms of house ignition, volatile urban interface fires, and also in settlements, transition inside settlements, and improve policy and provide recommendation regarding management inside those violent urban interface areas. And I would like to invite everyone to join this group. It is free, no obligations, but you can be a part, you can participate in review papers and make presentations and yeah, be part of the community. Feel free to email me. Yeah, unfortunately, I forgot to add the link, registration link to my presentation, but yeah. Yeah, feel free to contact me, and I can provide Julian information later. I can send to everyone.
Yeah, on our next email to our attendees, we can send the link to the recording for this presentation, as well as the information that you are mentioning right now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for a really comprehensive presentation. Pretty interesting, pretty neat. Yeah, we would like to advertise our next seminar on wildfires. This is going to be a different approach to what we had today. It's going to come from Richard Watley, who is the Strategic Fire Operations Officer and Regional fire coordinator at Kimberley Land Council in Western Australia. We are going to have a different approach here, which shows how Indigenous communities have a role in fire management in another state in Australia. So yeah, Alex, again, thank you for your presentation. To all of our attendees, thank you for joining this afternoon. There is an issue with the date here. It's not the 4th of February, but the 4th of March. We will send you the link for registration to this event along the information that Alex already mentioned.
Thank you, Julian, and thanks everyone. Have a good day. Have a good weekend.
Have a good weekend. Goodbye.
Bye.